Hi guys, Pete the Wargamer here, back once again with another speed painting tutorial. This time around I'm going to be tackling the Astra Militarum and we'll be painting a whole start collecting box from primer to tabletop in around about 4 hours. Now before I go on, I just want to say a big thank you to Firestorm Games for providing me with the miniatures used in this tutorial. Be sure to check out the link below for discounts on Games Workshop products. So first, let's discuss some key points of speed painting. Limit your colour palette. Keeping the number of paints you're using to a minimum will reduce the number of steps. You'll find that some colour schemes are better suited to speed painting than others, particularly those that use darker colours. Paint in batches. Painting 10 or 20 miniatures at a time will allow you to get into a rhythm whilst painting them. Painting every mini in your batch before moving on to the next colour will allow you to develop your technique and hasten your painting. Keep things simple. If your main focus is gaming, then those finely detailed highlights you spent a long time on will not be quite as visible once on the tabletop. So save your detailed painting to individual characters or centerpiece miniatures and just focus on getting the basic colours down on the rest of your army. Before we can start to paint, you will first need to prime your miniatures so the later layers of paint adhere to the plastic better. This also gives us the opportunity to start our painting by opting for a dark grey primer. Mechanicus Standard Grey is a good choice for this, but you feel free to choose whatever dark grey primer you have to hand. This dark starting colour will contrast against the light greys and whites to serve as what I call the shadow layer. This is a dark layer of paint that will only be visible in the recessed areas once we've painted over it and will create the effect of shadows. This not only improves realism but also helps those details to stand out. For the winter camouflage of our troops and tank, we want to create a light grey and white scheme. We've already gone some way to achieving this with Mechanicus Standard Grey, but we want to go further by applying some Dawnstone. However, we want to preserve that shadow layer I mentioned earlier, and the best way to do this is to apply the paint via some dry brushing. Dry brushing involves loading up a fairly large brush with some paint and removing some of the excess onto a tissue or a piece of paper until only a small amount of paint remains in the bristles. As I've already mentioned, the paint I'll be using in this step is Dawnstone. With your dry brush ready, drag it across the whole miniature but try to avoid the boots where possible. The paint will start to accumulate onto the raised areas, leaving only the black and grey recesses visible. As you can see, this is a very quick and easy step to perform. Leaving the black visible will allow us to avoid using washes to bring out these shadows later on, which not only means we don't have to spend time applying the wash, but we can also avoid waiting for it to dry thoroughly before progressing. One thing I like to do while dry brushing is to keep my brush ever so slightly damp, as it helps to avoid that dusty texture that can often form. Even though this technique is called dry brushing, having a small amount of moisture in your bristles will give you better results. This technique is often referred to as wet brushing. Also, be sure to rinse out your brushes after painting around 4 or 5 of your miniatures in your batch, as this will help to prevent the accumulation of paint in your bristles and will keep your paintbrush workable for longer. Now that we've achieved the dark grey of the fatigues, we next want to start working on the more solid materials and bringing them up to white. This goes for the flak armour of the guardsmen, their weapons and the tank's hull too. We don't want to go straight to white though, so we'll be using some dry brushing of the very light Celestra Grey instead. Follow the same steps as before, but be a little more careful with your application, focusing only on the areas mentioned before and leaving the cloth alone. Using a smaller brush should make this a little easier. For the commissar, use a smaller brush and focus your application onto the trousers, cuffs and collar of the overcoat. As well as using the regular dry brushing method over the tank, I'll also be using a small piece of sponge dipped in some Celestra Grey and dabbing it over the surface of the tank. This will create the effect of a whitewash that's been applied but has become worn through exposure. Next, I will be applying a very light dry brush of white scar over the edges of the areas that we painted with Celestra Grey. By using a lot less pressure than before, the paint should only gather on the hard edges, helping to emphasize these details and giving them a sharpness. For the hull of the tank, follow a similar technique as before, but focus your application onto the center of the larger patches of the light grey. This will help to emphasize that worn down whitewash effect we're looking to create. Next, we can start to pick out a few of the smaller details, but before we do this, we first need to thin our paint a little. Mix in water in small amounts until your consistency is similar to what you see here. We're aiming for a consistency that will allow us to quickly apply the paint in a few quick brush strokes. Our first step in using this technique involves applying a signature colour. This is to help bring out the colour to an otherwise monochrome miniature. I've opted for Mephiston Red as it's bright, rich and ties nicely in with our commissar. Use this paint to pick out some of the smaller details such as the Imperial insignia and optics, leaving the darker recesses intact like before. You can also use this paint to tackle the Commissar's sash and trim on the overcoat. Next, we want to pick out the more raised parts of the face with a quick layer of Cadian Fleshtone to bring out the skin colour in these areas. You don't need to tackle the hands here, as these will be covered in the next step. For the leather and remaining cloth areas of the model, we want to apply some Dryad Bark, thinned in the same manner as previously. Apply this paint over the boots, webbing, belt and hands to create the appearance of gloves being worn to combat the cold climate. I'll also be using this paint as a base coat for the tank tracks. This will give them a rusty and dirty base colour. For the metal areas, I'm using some Leadbelcher, which, as it's a base paint, should cover nicely over the greys. Apply your thin paint over the metal areas, but don't paint the whole area. By making sure you leave the recesses dark, you will help to add definition and bring out those details in the process. You can also use this as a dry brush along the metal tracks. This will create the appearance that the brown rust and mud has been worn down, revealing the bare steel beneath. Also, at this stage, don't worry too much about little mistakes among the large amount of miniatures. Smaller overspills will be unnoticeable, and after all, we're looking to get your army painted up for the tabletop, not for the parade ground. These next couple of steps will be focused on painting the more individual miniatures such as the Commissar and also the vehicle. The first of these is to apply a layer of Retributor Armour over some of the gold detailings on the Commissar. Focus on the braiding and handguard of the sword and apply these in the same way as the previous Leadbelcher. Once you've finished, be sure to thoroughly clean out your brushes and change your water to avoid any cross-contamination of metal flakes to your other paints. While we have avoided using washes so far to create shading on our miniatures, we can use some Agrax Earthshade to add some weathering to the tank. Focus the application of this wash into some of the recessed areas to simulate the appearance of mud and grime. You can also paint some vertical streaks along the side panels to represent dirt that has been washed down the sides. And here we have the completed Astra Militarum start collecting set painted in a winter theme. I finished things off by creating a simple basing scheme using some textured paints, some dry brushing and some Valhallan Blizzard to create a snowy effect. This whole set took me around 4 hours to paint. While the paint job certainly won't win any awards, it's a good way of quickly getting your force painted up. After all, it's much better to play with a fully painted army than a tide of bare grey plastic. If you enjoyed the speed painting style of video and would like to see me give the same treatment to other Horde type armies, do let me know in the comments below. You can find a full list of all the paints that I've used in this tutorial in the description below, along with any other equipment that I've used to create this video. As I've already mentioned, a big thank you to Firestone Games for providing me with the miniatures used in this tutorial. You should definitely check those guys out and you'll find a link to them in the description below. And so the only thing left to say is, thanks for watching and goodbye.